Some of the most praised traits in your personality may not be signs of health, but of survival. Think about that for a moment. The qualities people admire most in you, the patience, the agreeableness, the way you never make things difficult, the way you always seem to know how to smooth the edges of a room, to make others comfortable, to keep the peace. What if those weren't gifts you developed? What if they were solutions you discovered as a child, in a family, in a world that wasn't always safe enough for you to simply be? That question is not comfortable. I know that. It has a way of sitting in the chest like something half swallowed. But it is exactly the right question. Because sometimes the most important things we need to look at are the ones we've been quietly taught to call our strengths. Before we go any further, if something in what I just said already landed somewhere real in you, I want to hear about it. Leave a comment below. Which of these good behaviors have you always seen as part of your personality but never questioned? Your answer might be the beginning of something. And if this kind of exploration matters to you, subscribe. This is the kind of work we do here every week, carefully, without shortcuts. Now, let me introduce you to an idea that Carl Jung spent much of his life developing, because it gives us a language for what we're really talking about. Jung called it the persona. Not persona in the casual modern sense, a social media brand, a professional face. He meant something far more specific and far more alive than that. The persona in Jungian psychology is the mask we construct in response to what the world around us needs us to be. It begins forming in childhood. It is shaped by what was rewarded, what was punished, what was loved, and what was quietly but unmistakably rejected. In many ways, the persona is a work of genius. It is the psyche's most sophisticated adaptation tool. The child who learns that showing anger leads to withdrawal of love does not simply stop showing anger. He builds a self around not showing it. A self that is calm, agreeable, easy to be around. A self that earns love by making love feel effortless. And this works. For a while, sometimes for decades, this works beautifully. The problem, as Jung saw it, is not that the persona exists. We all have one. The problem arises when we begin to mistake the mask for the face, when we no longer remember that there is something underneath it, when the identity we constructed to survive becomes the only identity we know how to inhabit. Here is the image that stays with me when I think about this. Imagine a mask made of fine porcelain, smooth on the surface, perfectly formed, admirable even. You can see nothing wrong with it from the outside, but inside that mask there are cracks, invisible ones, pressing from within. Not flaws in the mask itself, but pressure. The pressure of everything that had nowhere else to go. Everything that was real and human and inconvenient and therefore quietly buried beneath the perfection of the surface. The more beautiful the mask, the more powerful that internal pressure tends to be. Because beauty in this case is not a sign of wholeness. It is a sign of how much work has gone into containment. Jung called what gets buried the shadow, the repository of everything the persona cannot afford to be. And here is what matters for what we're about to explore. The shadow is not evil. It is not darkness in a moral sense. It is simply what was not allowed, what had no place in the version of you that was safe to show the world. Not all masks feel fake. Some feel like your personality. And that is precisely why this is so difficult to see. Sign number 1. You say yes before you even check in with yourself. Not occasionally. Not when you're tired or overwhelmed. Almost reflexively. Someone asks something of you, and before you've taken a breath, you've already agreed. And then, somewhere, in the quiet afterward, you notice something like regret, or exhaustion, or a very small, distant resentment that you immediately talk yourself out of. This pattern has a name in psychological literature: fawning. It was first described in the context of trauma responses alongside fight, flight, and freeze. But in everyday life, it looks nothing like trauma. It looks like helpfulness. It looks like generosity. It looks like being the person everyone can count on. The question worth sitting with is this: when you say yes, are you responding to what you genuinely want to give, or to what you fear will happen if you don't? Because those are two very different internal experiences. One comes from fullness, the other comes from a kind of low-grade fear that has been present for so long it no longer registers as fear. It registers as your personality. Sign number 2. Conflict feels like danger, not disagreement. There is a significant difference between disliking conflict, which is a reasonable human preference, and experiencing conflict as a threat to your very sense of safety. The first is a preference. The second is a survival response. If the prospect of someone being upset with you creates something in your body that resembles panic, heart rate, tightness, an almost physical need to resolve the tension immediately, at any cost. That is your nervous system responding to conflict the way it learned to respond a long time ago, not as a difference of opinion, as a threat to connection, as something that, if not immediately managed, could end something important. People who grew up in environments where conflict meant instability, where a raised voice meant danger, where disapproval meant withdrawal of warmth, where tension in the air meant you had to disappear into your best behavior to restore safety. Those people often build identities around preventing conflict entirely. They become gifted readers of the emotional temperature of a room. They learn to intervene before things escalate. They are, by most external accounts, extraordinarily good at keeping the peace. But peace that is maintained through constant vigilance is not peace. It is a performance of peace, sustained at enormous personal cost. Some people don't avoid conflict because they're peaceful. They avoid it because they're afraid of disappearing. Sign number 3, you experience excessive guilt when you prioritize yourself. Not just discomfort, not just the mild awkwardness of learning a new habit. Real guilt. The kind that feels almost morally weighted, as though choosing yourself is somehow a betrayal of someone, somewhere, even when no one is watching, even when no one was asking anything of you. This is one of the clearest markers of a persona built around being selfless. Because when the identity is organized around giving, meeting needs, making things easier for others, choosing differently doesn't just feel unfamiliar, it feels wrong. It triggers something that functions like shame. And here is what's worth understanding. Guilt is appropriate when we actually harm someone. It is a moral signal with a genuine function. But guilt that fires every time you rest, every time you decline, every time you put your own need into the sentence, that guilt is not a moral signal. It is a conditioned response. It is the internalized voice of an environment that taught you, one way or another, that your needs were less important than your usefulness. Sign number 4, your emotions go through a filter before they come out, if they come out at all. You know what you think about a situation before you know what you feel about it? You have a sophisticated capacity to analyze your emotional experience, to contextualize it, to understand why you feel what you feel, and in that understanding to quietly set it aside, to process privately what others express openly. On the surface, this looks like emotional maturity, and to some extent, emotional. Regulation is genuinely valuable. The ability to not react from every passing feeling is a real skill. But there is a difference between regulating your emotions and habitually suppressing them. Regulation is conscious and chosen. Suppression is automatic and often invisible to the person doing it. It is not a decision to pause before speaking. It is a deeply ingrained pattern of not fully allowing emotions to exist in the first place. Jung understood this with precision. What gets pushed into, the shadow does not dissolve. It finds other exits. The person who cannot access sadness often lives with a diffuse and inexplicable heaviness. The person who cannot allow anger often experiences sudden and disproportionate eruptions. The body, as we have come to understand far better since Jung's time, keeps a register of everything the persona cannot afford to hold. Now I want to pause here, because I recognize what can happen in the middle of a list like this. You may be nodding along, recognizing yourself in 1 or 2 or 3 of these, and feeling something that sits somewhere between insight and unease, like a door is open that you didn't know existed. That feeling is significant. It means you are in the territory where real work begins. Before we continue, I want to pause here for a moment. Everything we are exploring, I know it can awaken something in you. A desire to go deeper than a video allows. I've been there too. And when I was, what I needed wasn't more information. I needed structure. A real framework for doing this kind of inner work with guidance. If you're feeling that pull right now, there's a link in the description. Take a look when the video ends. Now let's keep going. The behaviors we've named so far are often the visible ones, the ones that earn you praise, the ones that show up in how others describe you. But there are 4 more signs, and these tend to live deeper, further from the surface, in the place where the cracks in the porcelain press hardest. Sign number 5. You feel a quiet resentment you don't think you're allowed to feel. Resentment is one of the most uncomfortable emotions to acknowledge in yourself when your identity is built around being generous and kind. Because kind people aren't resentful. Generous people don't keep a tally. Good people don't feel bitter. And yet, there may be a way in which you give and give and give, and something in you is quietly, carefully tracking the balance, noticing who doesn't reciprocate, noticing the times you said yes when you wanted to say no, noticing the ways your generosity is taken for granted, and then hating yourself for noticing. because noticing feels like selfishness. Jung's framework is illuminating here. Resentment is often shadow speaking. It is the repressed self, the one with preferences, with limits, with genuine needs, asserting itself in the only way it's been left available, not through honest expression, which would require a kind of self disclosure that feels dangerous, but through the back channel of a feeling that feels like a character flaw. It is not a character flaw, it is information. It is the inner self telling you that something is out of balance, that something is being given at a cost that isn't sustainable. What if your kindness was never a choice, but a strategy? Sign number 6. You're not entirely sure who you are outside of what you do for others. This one requires stillness to notice, which is part of why it so rarely gets examined. Because if your identity is organized around being useful, around being there for people, around being the reliable one, then you tend to stay busy. Usefulness is always available. There is always another person to help, another problem to solve, another gap to fill. But ask yourself, what do you want when no one needs anything? What do you enjoy? Not because it produces something, not because it contributes to anyone, but simply because it brings you alive? Who are you when you're not being good? For some people, these questions land with a startling blankness. Not because nothing is there, pyong, but because the persona has been so totalizing, so complete, that access to the self beneath it has become genuinely difficult. The authentic self, what Jung called the self with a capital S, has been buried under so many layers of adaptation that even its voice is hard to distinguish from the voice of the mask. This is identity confusion as an outcome of chronic self-suppression. And it does not feel dramatic from the inside. It feels like being a little bit vague about yourself, like having trouble answering the question, what do you really want? Like being more fluent in other people's needs than in your own. Sign number 7. You are chronically tired in a way that rest doesn't fix. Not because you work long hours, though you may. Not because you sleep poorly, though that may be a consequence. But because maintaining a persona is exhausting work, and unlike physical labor, it never fully stops. The vigilance required to monitor the emotional temperature of a room. The energy required to manage your self-presentation. The constant internal processing of what is safe to show and what must be hidden. The effort of being consistently easy, consistently pleasant, consistently available. These things have a cumulative cost that is real, physiological, and often invisible. This kind of exhaustion is sometimes called a signal of what researchers and clinicians working in trauma recovery describe as high-functioning dysfunction. From the outside, everything looks fine, better than fine, but the interior system is running far above its sustainable capacity. And eventually the gap between the external presentation and the internal experience begins to cost more than it's worth. Rest helps temporarily, but rest does not dissolve the persona. It doesn't address the underlying pattern. And so the exhaustion returns because the source of the exhaustion has never been named. Sign number 8. You have a complicated relationship with your own anger. Not simply that you rarely express it, but that you may struggle to even recognize it as it happens. That by the time anger registers for you, it has either transmuted into something else, sadness, self-criticism, physical tension, or it has built up long enough to come out in ways that feel disproportionate, that embarrass you, that you subsequently explain away. Anger, in Jungian psychology, is one of the most significant shadow contents for people who have built personas around warmth and agreeableness, because anger is the emotion most directly linked to limits, to the self saying, this is mine, this is too much, this is not acceptable. No. When the self has been trained, for whatever reason, to make itself small and safe and easy, anger becomes a luxury it cannot afford. And so it goes underground, into the body, into the narrative of, I'm just not an angry person, into the patient suffering of situations that genuinely deserve a response. But anger, like all suppressed content, does not dissolve. It accumulates, and in accumulating, it often begins to shape the inner world in ways that are far more destabilizing than the clean, honest expression of it would ever have been. The more perfect you seem, the more might be missing underneath. Now I want to turn towards something that I think matters as much as anything else in this video. You didn't decide to be this way? That might sound obvious, but it needs to be said clearly, because there is a kind of self-critical voice that shows up in this work. The voice that looks at these patterns and interprets them as weakness, as a failure of character, as something to be ashamed of. That voice is wrong. These patterns, the people-pleasing, the conflict avoidance, the emotional suppression, the resentment, the exhaustion, the lost identity, These did not arise from personal failure. They arose from intelligence. The intelligence of a child or a young person adapting to an environment in which authenticity did not feel safe, in which being fully themselves, with all their needs and feelings and preferences and imperfections, was not a viable option. Perhaps the environment was overtly difficult, a home marked by addiction, by emotional volatility, by criticism that felt relentless. Perhaps it was subtler than that, a parent who needed you to need them, a family where being okay was the only acceptable identity, a world that rewarded performance and punished vulnerability. Whatever the specific shape it took, the adaptation made sense then. It was not a flaw, it was a solution. And the fact that the solution is no longer serving you, the fact that the mask has become too heavy to carry with grace, does not mean you did something wrong. It means you have grown beyond the environment that made the mask necessary. You were not rewarded for being yourself. You were rewarded for being safe. Before we reach the final place I want to take you in this video, I want to extend an invitation. If you've stayed with this all the way through, and I imagine something in you has found a reason to, then I want to ask you something. Leave it in the comments. Take a breath first. And then, if your good side is a mask, what do you feel is waiting underneath it? You don't have to have a neat answer. The question itself is the work. And if you've found value in this exploration, a like and a subscription tell me that this kind of depth matters to you, and they help this content find the people who need it most. If you're ready to take what we've explored here into something more structured, a real framework for this inner work, the link in the description is still there for when you're ready. So, what do we do with all of this? The answer, in Jungian terms, is not to destroy the persona, not to swing to the opposite extreme and abandon every form of social consideration and tact and care for others. The persona serves real functions. Without some version of it, social life would be barely navigable. What Jung spoke of, what he called individuation, is something more nuanced and more demanding than simply dismantling the mask. It is the slow, often difficult process of learning to distinguish between the mask and the face beneath it, of beginning to have a relationship with the contents of the shadow, the anger, the needs, the preferences, the authentic desires that is conscious rather than reactive. Integration means that the self beneath the persona gets a seat at the table. It means that the good behavior can remain where it is genuinely chosen, but the energy required to perform it around the clock begins to be released. It means that there is a you that exists even when no one needs anything. A you that can say no without the architecture of guilt collapsing on top of you. A you that can feel anger and recognize it for what it is before it routes itself into something unrecognizable. This is not a fast process. It does not arrive like an insight, complete and stable. It arrives in glimpses, in moments where you catch yourself about to agree and you pause instead. In moments where you notice the resentment and rather than burying it, you ask what it is trying to tell you. In moments where you allow yourself to be exactly as you are, without performance, and survive it. The philosopher you carry inside you, the part that brought you to a video with this title, already knows something is there, already suspects that the good person in the mirror is not the whole story. That suspicion is not a problem to be solved. It is an invitation to begin. And here is where I leave you. Not with an answer, but with the weight of your own mask, held just a little more consciously than it was an hour ago. The question is not whether the mask will come off. The question is whether you're ready to begin learning what it has been protecting,